May 8th, 1978. Reinhold and Peter stood on the icy slopes of Mount Everest, preparing for what many believed was the most dangerous summit attempt in history. Until this moment, every climber who had reached the peak used bottled oxygen, ignoring the warnings of doctors who said it was impossible and swore the lack of oxygen at over 26,000 feet would leave them with permanent brain damage. Reinhold and Peter were determined to prove them wrong. This is the daring pursuit that began as a monumental achievement that spiraled into betrayal and controversy, breaking one of the most iconic climbing duos of the 20th century. Welcome to the Extreme Edge. By March 1978, Reinhold Messner and Peter Habeler had arrived on Everest, setting up their base camp on the Nepalese side. Their 1978 expedition was an independent part of a larger Austrian expedition led by Wolfgang Nares. As Reinhold and Peter stood at the foot of Everest, maybe they trembled a little, knowing how dangerous the challenge they were about to attempt really was. As they looked up to its towering peak, things seemed more real than ever. This was it. This was their time to shine. The pair had earned the nickname the Terrible Twins due to their similar climbing styles and a brotherly friendship. In the years before the expedition, the pair had become inseparable. But their bond was not made through blood, but by ice, rock, and the thin, unforgiving air of the world's highest peaks. A connection so profound it could only be understood by two souls who shared every ascent, every struggle, and every breathtaking summit. Now, this shared love for the mountains led them to the world's highest mountain. But to reach the summit of Everest, you need three traits: skill, experience, and courage. It just so happens Reinhold and Peter had all three in abundance. However, this expedition wouldn't be like other climbs they completed together. In fact, it was by far the most dangerous and pushed the boundaries of what was considered achievable in the mountaineering world. You see, Reinhold and Peter believed in a pure alpine-style ascent, which meant they limited the use of Sherpas where possible. While Sherpas helped establish base camp and ferry up supplies to the lower camps, Reinhold and Peter carried their own gear from the higher camps and would ultimately push for the summit alone. Their philosophy for the climb was self-sufficiency. This minimalist approach was entirely different from the large, siege-style expeditions that had been common on Everest, which often involved hundreds of porters, extensive fixed ropes, and multiple camps. But what stood out the most about their expedition was that they planned to reach the summit without any supplemental oxygen, a feat that had not yet been accomplished. Reinhold pushed for this unique style, but the true reasoning went much deeper than just self-sufficiency. He wanted to experience the harsh and intense high altitude instead of being hidden behind a mask. In his own words, he wanted to climb the mountain by fair means or not at all. This unique perspective stems from his philosophy that prioritized the human experience and respect for the mountain over competitive records, aided through technological means. He believed that using supplementary oxygen or extensive expedition support ruined the real experience. For him, the mountain was no longer the primary focus. Instead, it was the human element, the individual's weaknesses, strengths, and ability to cope with dangerous situations that were important. He wanted to experience the mountain in its truest form, and in time, he would. Tiny detour on this chaos train. If you'd like to be part of the Extreme community, get early access to our videos and exclusive polls, come join us on Patreon. See you there. I think at the time, many people struggled to understand why Reinhold pushed so hard for this kind of expedition. After all, this was during an era when doctors and medical professionals still believed that trying to summit Everest without supplemental oxygen was a death sentence. I mean, we're talking about a mountain that's over 29,000 feet tall. As far back as the 1920s, skeptics argued that summiting Everest without oxygen was not humanly possible. This idea persisted right through to the 1970s. Doctors at the time assured the climbers they would come home with brain damage and wouldn't be able to recognize their wives. I don't know about you, but if a doctor told me that, I'd certainly feel a little scared. Do you think you could go against the doctor's orders? Would you feel safe doing so? Well, to Reinhold and Peter, it was an easy decision. Deep down, they knew it could be done. And in 1978, they got their opportunity to prove the world wrong. But it didn't come without some danger. You see, even inexperienced climbers can ascend several thousand feet without bottled oxygen. Once you reach a height known as the death zone, things become very dangerous. The death zone is any altitude over 8,000 meters, or 26,247 feet. The air pressure and oxygen levels at these heights are insufficient to sustain human life for a long period of time. Scientists claim there's approximately 1/3 of the oxygen available at sea level, and for those who have found themselves in this dangerous position, they liken it to breathing through a straw. Doesn't sound fun, does it? But that's just the beginning of your problems. Slowly, the brain and lungs are starved for oxygen, and essentially, the body begins to break down. With this, symptoms like confusion, poor decision-making, and hallucinations begin to appear. At such immense heights, the body cannot adequately acclimatize to the lower oxygen levels, and the lack of oxygen begins to cause organs to fail. So you can see why the doctors considered Reinhold and Peter's expedition extremely dangerous. They couldn't help but think what kind of climber would embark on a journey that was likely to kill him. Well, as it turns out, Reinhold and Peter weren't like other climbers of the era. They were pioneers, and they were ready to risk it all. From a young age, they seemed destined for climbing greatness. The pair grew up as strangers less than 50 miles away from each other in Tyrol, a region that straddles the Alps of northern Italy and western Austria. Reinhold was born in the small village of Vilnos on the Italian side of Tyrol. His father introduced him to the outdoors and climbing at a young age, and by 5, he had already reached the summit of the Sas Regais, a nearly 10,000-foot peak near his home. Looking back now, it's easy to see he was born to climb, but as a youngster roaming the rocky outcrop that surrounded his village, it was really just play. As a teen, Reinhold's love for climbing grew stronger. He often disappeared for most of the day with his brother Gunther. Together, the pair packed a light bag of some pitons, a rope, bread, and a chunk of cheese. This was all they needed to be happy, and they spent their childhoods climbing the mountains that surrounded their home. Inspired by what he now calls classical alpinism, Reinhold's obsession with climbing shaped most of his 20s, where he completed winter ascents, new routes, and solo climbs in his homeland. Whereas on the Austrian side of the Tyrol, a slightly older Peter Habeler followed a similar path. After losing his father at a young age, Peter was heartbroken and turned to his grandfather, who encouraged him to explore the mountains surrounding their home. As he grew older, an undeniable passion emerged from these early experiences. By the mid-1960s, Peter successfully climbed a steep and dangerous granite wall on the Italian side of Mont Blanc, known as the Central Pillar of Fresnay. The route he climbed was widely considered one of the most difficult lines in the Alps at the time, and he became only the second person to complete it. Despite both growing up in the same region and with a love for alpinism, Reinhold and Peter wouldn't cross paths until 1965. During this year, a mutual friend invited both climbers to join a winter ascent of the Tofana Pillar in the Dolomites of northern Italy. Looking back, Peter remembers how similar Reinhold seemed to himself, yet, because they lived on opposite sides of the border, they rarely socialized outside of climbing. It's unlikely Peter had any idea of how close the two would become during this first encounter, nor did he ever imagine they would go on to change the course of mountaineering history. In the years that followed, they joined forces, and the relationship transformed from acquaintances to close friends. They went on to climb several mountains together, including the Europaja in the Andes, as well as the Eiger and Gasherbrum 1. By the 1970s, they had made a name for themselves in the mountaineering world, following their bold and quick summit of the hidden peak in the Himalayas without oxygen. But could they use this same style on the world's tallest mountain? Could they really reach their summit without supplemental oxygen? That was the question everybody wanted to know. It wasn't until the spring of 1978 that we'd finally get an answer. After nearly 2 months of carrying supplies up to higher camps and acclimating, Reinhold and Peter were getting ready to push for their first summit attempt by mid-April. But then, disaster struck. Peter became incredibly sick after eating a tin of sardines and was forced to remain at Camp 3 for several days as he emptied his stomach. Food poisoning can break even the strongest of individuals. Now imagine being this sick 24,000 feet above sea level. I think it's safe to say it would have been a very unpleasant experience. As Peter lay face down in camp trying to hold down what little food and water he could, Reinhold remained laser-focused on the task at hand. He continued working up the mountain, but the same night he also found himself in trouble. That evening, a terrifying storm rolled over the South Col, forcing him and 2 Sherpas to take shelter inside their tents. The howling wind whipped their tents for 2 full days as they desperately shoveled snow and tried to keep the stove going. Looking back, Reinhold called it 2 of the worst days of his life, as at any moment he was prepared for the tent poles to collapse and leave them exposed to the harsh climate. I find it hard to imagine the level of fear that likely came with being stuck on top of Everest, helpless and without any option but to pray the storm passes. Luckily for Reinhold, his tent held up, and the storm finally passed. He emerged from the terrifying experience more motivated than ever, but Peter, on the other hand, was beginning to have serious doubts. Whether it was the food poisoning or the time alone in his tent with his own thoughts, Peter's nerves began to get the better of him. The warnings of doctors and skeptics flooded his mind, and he couldn't help but worry about what would happen to his brain if he continued to climb without oxygen. It got to the point that Peter even reached out to base camp to see if anyone was preparing to summit with oxygen and if he could join them, but his offer was refused, and this turned out to be exactly the motivation he needed. Looking back, Peter said, "I was gripped by a burning anger. I wanted to go up with Reinhold as planned, just to prove myself to the others, and all my other reservations were completely swept away. I didn't even care about the possible physical or mental damage that might result. I was governed only by a blind anger which drove me on." With this, the men were finally ready. Just before they set off on their summit push on May 6th from Camp 3, the men sat down and quickly made a pact. Should either of them find themselves in serious danger, they were on their own. The climbers knew that at these kinds of altitudes, it's almost impossible to help each other, and that was just another thing they shared in common. You see, climbing at altitude is incredibly hard to explain. It's like a cocktail of euphoria and suffering. It's certainly not for the faint-hearted. As Reinhold and Peter pushed for the summit, the air grew increasingly thin with each small increase in altitude. The moisture slowly left their bodies, placing them at risk of dehydration, and their voices grew thin. Even the fittest of climbers can quickly find themselves in trouble as they struggle to make it up a gentle slope. It's just a different world when you reach the death zone. Even simple tasks that you've done 1,000 times, like lighting a stove, become difficult. As Peter himself said, mountaineering at extreme altitudes has nothing whatsoever to do with normal mountaineering. Up there, every moment becomes savagely difficult. But the pair were motivated to finish what they had started. By May 8th, they had reached Camp 5 at nearly 28,000 feet and were closing in on the summit. But things had become overwhelming. Without oxygen, every step of the last 1,000 feet was torture. The men were forced to take a break after just a few steps, and at times, it probably felt like they were never going to make it. The psychological challenge was beginning to weigh on Reinhold, and he felt like he was on the edge of death. In these moments, the thought of giving up to remain alive likely played over in his head. After all, this wasn't the first time he found himself in a life-or-death situation. Flashbacks of a terrifying event that happened 8 years earlier played over in his mind. Reinhold had been climbing Nanga Parbat in Pakistan alongside his brother Gunther. After painstakingly battling against the elements, the pair made it to the summit after scaling the notorious Rupal Face, a nearly 15,000-foot wall of rock and ice. After taking in the panoramic view of the Himalayas at the top, they started their descent, and this is where things went seriously wrong. Both men were exhausted and their supplies were running short. Their excitement had now turned to despair. The temperature was plummeting, and they were alone on one of the world's most challenging mountains. But Nanga Parbat would show no mercy to the climbers, and they'd be forced to make several tough decisions. After being forced to take shelter under a rocky outcrop, they huddled tightly and slept overnight, not far from the summit. When they woke, the brothers knew another night like that would likely be the end of them. Reinhold was forced to make a tough decision. Would he push on and look for water, leaving his brother behind? Could he just leave his younger brother behind, knowing that it could be the last time he ever saw him? Was it worth the risk? What do you think? Could you leave behind a sibling in such a dangerous scenario? Ultimately, Reinhold managed to push the worry aside and decided it was for the best. But this was the last time he ever saw Gunther. The next day, Reinhold found himself standing over a fresh avalanche, and it quickly dawned on him that his brother was probably buried beneath the thick white snow. With tears in his eyes, he screamed for his brother, and he used his hands to dig through the snow, but it was no use. He was buried deep beneath the snow. I can only imagine how heartbroken he must have felt. The courage he showed to try to save their lives backfired, and now he was forced to reckon with the consequences of the dangerous climb. What had he done? Had he just stayed behind, would his brother be alive? Why did he push on? Experiences like this can have an everlasting effect on our minds, but his nightmare wasn't over yet. Reinhold was forced to make one last tough decision. He would have to leave his brother behind or risk losing his own life. By now, Reinhold was suffering from severe frostbite. He staggered down the remainder of the mountain and was later found by several workers in a nearby forest. He returned to Europe broken in body and spirit, having lost 7 toes to frostbite. Now, almost 8 years later, he found himself in the same position. Would he be able to survive this time around, or would he succumb to a fate like Gunther? The questions that race through a person's mind when they're exhausted and in danger are truly terrifying. And once again, Reinhold was going to have to dig deep to survive. Those memories stayed with him as he and Peter pressed on, each step a reminder of how much was at stake on Everest. Reinhold and Peter continued to climb upwards in silence, hoping this would conserve energy. And just when all hope seemed lost, and Peter began hallucinating, they suddenly realized they were standing on the summit. The two men were quickly overcome with joy. They reached the top of Everest at 1:15 p.m. on May 8th local time, becoming the first humans in recorded history to summit this feared mountain without supplemental oxygen. Despite the overwhelming euphoria, the two men were quickly plunged back into reality. By this point, Peter's fingers were tingling, and he feared it meant something serious. The urge to descend overcame both men, and by now, Reinhold was beginning to suffer from snow blindness. Their brains were severely starved of oxygen, and it's clear they were beginning to suffer from the altitude. Less than an hour after reaching the summit, however, they found themselves back at Camp 4, but they weren't out of trouble yet. That night, Reinhold experienced severe pain in his eyes and struggled to see. His snow blindness left him partially blind, and the following morning, Peter was forced to carefully guide his partner down the mountain to safety. You might be thinking this is where our story ends, but you'd be wrong. Despite going through an experience that would generally bring two people together, Reinhold and Peter were later torn apart. Little did they know, but the rope that guided them on their way to base camp would be the last one they ever shared. As Reinhold and Peter returned to society, they were welcomed back like heroes to their respective nations. However, skeptics almost immediately began disputing their claims, leading Reinhold to blame prominent climbers such as Tenzing Norgay for the rumors. The terrible twins offered a unified front on defense, but in time their relationship would take a dramatic turn for the worse. The initial cracks in their relationship began to appear shortly after they returned home. While both men celebrated the success, their individual accounts of the expedition, particularly regarding their roles and contributions, started to diverge. Reinhold, known for his strong personality and record-keeping, presented a narrative that emphasized his leadership and strategic planning, but this upset Peter, who felt his own contributions were sometimes downplayed. This subtle but significant difference in their public narratives drove a wedge between their friendship. Peter was the first to release a book about their bold adventure called Everest, Impossible Victory. In it, he appears to take a jab at Reinhold, writing, "Even if the reader may gain the impression from these that he was the leader and I was simply a passenger, the applause of the general public is not as important to me. But Reinhold needs their recognition. He likes to appear on television. He needs the interviews in the newspapers. He likes to shine. I don't like any heroic poses." This infuriated Reinhold. How could someone he considered a brother speak of him in such a way to the public? After everything they had been through, this was the beginning of the end for their relationship. The American edition of Peter's book, The Lonely Victory, Mount Everest 78, also greatly irritated Reinhold. He believed Peter was somehow suggesting he had conquered Everest by himself. Their disagreements continued to intensify, with Peter publicly calling out his former climbing partner. In one interview, "We never had any problems as long as I was not making anything of myself. It seems to me that Reinhold simply wants to be number one, and he doesn't want anybody to be beside him." Their public feud served as fuel for the tabloids of the era. People were almost as interested in their back-and-forth arguments as they were in their record-breaking Everest climb. The feud intensified over the years, and the media, which are always eager for a compelling narrative, certainly played a role in prolonging the conflict. What had started as a blossoming friendship that led two men to conquer an almost impossible task had turned into a bitter rivalry. Despite the public animosity, the historical significance of their 1978 Everest ascent remains undisputed. It was a monumental achievement that paved the way for future oxygenless ascents and inspired generations of climbers. However, the personal cost of their differing perspectives and the subsequent public feud left a lasting impact on their relationship. I guess it could be said that great things often come with greater sacrifices. What do you think? Was Reinhold in the wrong? Or could Peter have given him some slack, knowing how bold his personality could be? Looking back, their falling out likely came from more than just the comments. The two men did live very different lives. While Reinhold went off in pursuit of climbing all 14 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks, Peter returned to Austria, where he built a home and settled into a career as a guide and ski instructor. He had a wife and child, whereas Reinhold was recently divorced and more of a free spirit. While there have been occasional attempts at reconciliation or public acknowledgments of their shared history, a full and lasting mending of their friendship never really happened. Stories like this remind us that even our greatest achievements can be tested by ego and perspective. Friendships, like mountains, take effort and patience to endure, and sometimes what we carry down from the climb matters more than what we reach at the top. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.